Okay, this week we're going to be talking to someone that I've never met personally, but has been pointed to by a number of people, particularly one of my coworkers pointed to him as one of the bright and shining stars of the visual arts world. His name is Reza Ali, and he is a very prolific artist and coder, and he pretty much wraps his arm around much of what we think of when we think of art and technology as a combination. Hi, Reza. How you doing?
I'm doing good. Thank you for having me, Darwin. I'm honored to be called all those things.
Well, cool. I'm glad to be able to honor you. I'd like to start off the podcast by asking people to tell me a little bit about the work that they're currently doing. I know that you just had a gallery opening just the other day, right?
Yeah, yesterday I had a gallery opening, and that was through Codeme, which is a art tech games sort of non-profit association here in San Francisco. They put on great events, and they're getting into showing work. The last time they showed work was through Public Works, which is a kind of famous place in San Francisco for showing work. So, yeah, it was great. I just showed off some recent work I did last year with fluids and sort of real-time rendering. So it was a fun exploration, and yeah, the gallery opening went great. I can share some links with you guys.
Yeah, that'd be great if you toss them my way. I'll put them up on the website so that people can check it out.
Cool, will do.
What are some other work that you've done recently?
So recently, there was a visual show that I performed at. The show was at Stanford. They have a program called CARMA, which stands for the Center for Computer Research, Music, and Acoustics. And every year they have a show at the end of the year where their students, their graduate students, or undergrads, some of them perform their music, some have visuals, and so I got asked to do the visuals for a couple really talented electronic musicians working with tools like Maximus P, Jitter, Live, and all that good stuff. So their music is very eclectic and electronic, and I love that stuff. So it was a true honor to be part of that show. And some of the work, the whole set the whole show was actually live streamed. The visuals were also live streamed, but the quality, of course, isn't super HD. So
Right.
some of the stills can be found on my most recent on my website, and under the sketches tab, you can see sort of some of the sketches I was VJing with. Yeah, and that was really a show all about I had built these sketches, and these sketches were audio reactive, and my whole performance there was just unfolding the sketches over time and allowing people to see their sort of beauty as they sort of change and morph and transform. So it wasn't so much cutting up live video or applying filters, but more playing with generative systems and sort of modifying their sort of parameters and physics to exhibit certain behaviors that went with the music. I find that kind of stuff really interesting and fascinating. I mean, I play with these systems all the time at home when I'm developing them for either for fun or clients or whatever, and it's really nice to share that process of discovery with people and have that be a performance that they can enjoy.
Sure, I know what you mean. There's something about when you get the right generative system going, the next thing you know, an hour's gone by and you have kind of like a lot of drool on your shirt.
Yeah.
It's a fun process. So you're obviously wrapped into sort of advanced graphics and real-time performance and generative systems. Why don't you give us a little bit of your background to tell us how you get to here?
Well, I was always fascinated by math. I think the first time that I saw a sine wave plotted on a graphing calculator, I think it was like a TI-83. I think that was I don't know why, but I distinctly remember that moment, and it just blew my mind about how beautiful that curve is. But there was something about math that led me to study like engineering in undergrad. So I ended up getting a couple degrees in engineering, but also I was really obsessed about the aesthetics and the visuals. Like that was my main sort of obsession. So it first resurrected itself as like I loved drawing graffiti. I think that was like an early graphic design kind of study for me. I mean, and then photography became my main sort of tool of choice because you can compose very, very quickly. And but it was all about form and composition and the elements of design. So it was very intriguing. So as an undergrad, I ended up studying a mixture of like architecture and product design and electrical and mechanical engineering, and that was great because really I wasn't doing it because of any forced like thing. You must get a job. It was more like I was just interested in like building things and making things. After that, I had an opportunity to go to grad school at Media Arts and Technology at UC Santa Barbara, where I met Wesley Smith and Angus Forbes and Graham Wakefield and Lance Putnam and all these amazing sort of peers that I still, we still have conversations today and we still chat. And so I met those guys and they taught me, they basically opened up my world in terms of like computer programming, computer graphics, sound, visualization, real-time graphics. Those are the guys who really taught me everything that I know. So got to thank them.
Sure. Where did you do your undergrad?
I went to Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute.
Oh, sure. Okay. Well, that kind of makes sense because there aren't that many schools that allow you to pursue an engineering degree, but also take architecture and design and
Right.
kind of mix and match some of those disciplines. So that
Yeah.
actually kind of makes sense.
They had a great program. They had a product design and innovation program. That's where I actually started because it seemed most sort of up my alley.
Right.
Um,
So what of your early education led you to UCSD and this sort of like advanced media art stuff? What is it that caught your attention and
right.
made you say that's where I'm going?
I'm just going to correct you for a second. It was
Oh, sorry.
UC Santa Barbara.
Oh, I mean, yeah, right. SB,
Uh,
UCSB. I wrote it down wrong. Sorry.
okay. I guess what really led me there is I was looking for a place that would allow me to like foster my creativity and allow me to also grow technically. So, I mean, I applied to a couple places. I applied to, Media Lab, of course, Design Media Arts at UCLA, ITP at NYU. Um, and out of all those places, I think the place that I felt most at home was UC Santa Barbara. When I visited their labs and just the space that they had, it was um, the space that they had is very different from Media Lab, ITP, and DMA. What I really liked about the space was it just seemed open and empty, um, which is really nice because it's a blank canvas where you can really define yourself, define what you want to do and what you want to study. And really, the guidance at UCSB was fantastic because it wasn't overbearing. And some people need a lot of direction and guidance, but when I got there, I um, was ready to just explore a little bit and be a free spirit for a little bit and just figure out what it is that I was really passionate about. And that the school basically just allowed you to like do that without anyone really giving you a bad stare or anything like that. It was, and it's also right on the beach. So like people are really easygoing and the professors they're people and they understand, that aspect of life. So
Sure.
that was the key thing about that school that, I wasn't actually, to be honest, I wasn't actually going to go to grad school. I was a little bit sort of bummed that I didn't get into ITP or DMA or
Right.
MIT. So I was actually just going to go back into the working world and just get a job as a consultant in New York City. But, after visiting, I just kept an really open mind and found that it was just the right place. It just felt like this could be the best thing for my future.
Well, I think it's really interesting that one of the things that you found a real draw was an open and empty space, because it
Mhm.
seems like for a lot of people, that's the most intimidating kind of space possible. That if something has sort of like a build out of some fashion, it gives them the feeling of they know how to fill that kind of space up. But if it's totally empty, it's a different kind of imagination it takes to tackle that.
True, but I also think like when you have something that's already built up, there are kind of like set defined rules and regulations that you have to abide by, you know. Um, if there are no rules, you can make your own. I mean, yeah, you can totally go crazy as well, but I don't know. I think it's sometimes like you need that space where you are not told what to do.
Right.
You have to find what you want to do, right?
Right. So at Santa Barbara, then, working with or working around and with and interacting with people like Wesley and Graham and some of these folks, did you find them pushing you in directions that kind of broke your starting mold, or did
Yeah.
they did they tend to embrace what you were doing and extend that? This is one of the things that I think when I talk to people who go through an aggressive program, it seems like they're either broken or they're uh, like lifted up, but it doesn't seem like anyone just kind of coasts through a
Uh-huh.
heavy duty art grad program.
Yeah. Um, I think it was the relationship there was I came into grad school and I was, you know, sort of a little broken from undergrad because um, it was such an intense experience that all I wanted to do was make art. And I didn't want to learn any more technical things. I didn't want to learn how to code. I really didn't know how to uh, code at all, actually. I hated computer science as an undergrad because, you know, it wasn't taught the right way. I think there were, you know, what's interesting is um, they just didn't teach it the right way. So when I got to grad school, I was kind of stubborn in my ways, and I just wanted to use like Final Cut and Maya and you know, Photoshop and Illustrator just to do my work, my artwork. Even though I knew that wasn't the right path.
Right.
I knew that that wasn't going to push the boundaries. So when I saw what Wes and Graham and Lance and all these amazing people were doing at UC Santa Barbara and the ideas that they were expressing with code, the sort of art projects they were able to accomplish, I knew that like it was time to just, you know, suck it up and learn. I distinctly remember one day where I had just sort of like shown a project and I don't think, you know, I didn't feel good about it. And I was in one of the labs and Casey Reese's book, the blue one, Learning Processing, was on the table. And I just
Right.
sat there for like 6 hours just reading through that book because I was just so frustrated and ready to learn something new.
Right.
Um, so it's a very, you know, the process is not easy. It's very frustrating. It's hard. It's not, I mean, if it was easy, everybody would be doing it, right? So
Well, sometimes it does seem like everybody's doing it, though, doesn't it?
I think it's become a lot easier.
Right.
That's for sure. Like when I was, I think I sort of entered at a golden age where processing was out and open frameworks was being currently worked on. And there are some amazing things going on with WebGL and 3D stuff in the browser. So it's become so much easier now, for sure. And a lot more people are engaging in it. Maybe not to the degree of like Wesley or Graham, but I
Right.
think anyone can do a 3JS tutorial and do 3D graphics in the browser, right?
Sure. Sure.
So
So, talking, you say you weren't a coder, and then you kind of like slurped in the Casey Reese book, and next thing you know, you're a coder. But you obviously have kept that up as an important part of your practice, because I'm right in that you're primarily an open frameworks person, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I noticed that you're the person responsible for the OFX UI, which I think filled in a real need in the open frameworks community, which is creating robust and attractive
Yeah.
UI elements.
Yeah.
At what point did you sort of like to make the transition from being, all right, I'm going to use other people's coding stuff, to
Right.
feeling comfortable enough to say, yeah, I'm going to make something and I want other people to use it? Because it's very popular in the open frameworks world.
Yeah. Um, I think it was a, a sort of, let's see, I had just finished a project with Dead Mouse, and I wrote this basically a VJ application for his tour. That would be used for his tour. And I think it was like, it was a week of intense work, just staying up till like 5 a.m. in the morning every day, just like intensely coding. And then I think that was the point where I hit my 10,000 hours of like, oh, okay, I feel comfortable enough to implement anything. I think when you first start out coding, you're kind of like, you kind of dip your toes in, and then you get your foot in, and then at some point you're like, okay, I'm comfortable in the water, but then it takes a while for you to become a really good swimmer.
Right.
And I think after that project, I had realized, okay, I can swim, like I can do this. And I think when I became when I sort of understood that it was just a tool and you can write code that does anything, I think that was the point where I was like, you know what? I've been implementing like UI stuff over and over and over again in open frameworks. I'm pretty sure I'm not the only one. So I did one more project where I did visuals for a concert in Hong Kong, and after that project, like I was working super hard on it. The clients were constantly asking for changes and iterations and things, and I got kind of like a little burnt out, and I realized like what is so important here in this client work, what's so important for me as a designer, and like what's so important in terms of like being able to just, I guess, control what we're doing, right? And that was when I was like, well, a UI, of course. And I looked at the other UIs, and they were a little, aesthetically, I just didn't want to put them on top of my work.
Right.
They said something different. They said like debug screen, from the 80s or 90s.
Right.
No offense to the other people who wrote the UIs, they're fantastic in their own way. So that's when it started. I had a month off of free time, which is rare, and I decided to like, well, I've been using open frameworks for the last 2 years. Now I'm gonna give back to the community because they've given me so much knowledge, and just the tool set is amazing. So that was what spurred it. I think it was one of the best things that I ever did. I mean, it was definitely it's still an ongoing project. I still get GitHub issues and bug emails and things like that. But I think it's been really rewarding in terms of just getting it out to people and then seeing the feedback.
In what ways do you interact with the open framework community? Are you active on like the forums and stuff, or do you keep a lower profile and just mostly speak through your code?
I guess I keep a lower profile, to be honest. I used to post on the forums more. I don't post on the forums that much because I think usually if I'm searching on the forums, it's because I've run into like a wall, like a
Right.
giant wall. And I guess for the stuff that I'm doing, I haven't run into those walls yet. Or maybe I have and I just sort of solve them in my own way. But and to be honest, I just haven't had time to really engage in that aspect of the community. I think I'm more active on Twitter, so I'm more likely to tweet something to someone who's talking about open frameworks or share my work that way, or do it that way. I mean, then again, I also engage in projects that use open frameworks. Like I worked on clouds last year, and a little bit this year. And Clouds is an open frameworks project that it's a executable application that is a interactive documentary. It's completely generative. It has a bunch of generative systems inside of it, and many, 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 many creative coders worked on it.
Mm-hmm.
So James George and Jonathan Menard and Patricio and there's a bunch of great, amazing people working on that film. So I engaged in the open frameworks community that way as well. There was a couple hackathons in Brooklyn and at ITP that I was at, and got to hang out with a bunch of cool people. So,
Yeah. I think I first heard about that from Luc Dubois. I was in
yeah,
New York at one point, and he was talking about how exciting that project was, and
right.
a lot, and the number of people that were involved. That seemed to be a real vibrant
Right.
community coming together for that.
It's amazing because yeah, James George is one of the main like sort of coders behind the film, and he is also amazing at uh, what's going on. And he was able to just sort of build this sort of architecture that just like really works well. And then I was able to contribute like what I call like the Resonator to the film, and allow them to create these sort of like generative scenes in addition to the sort of our red, green, blue depth video.
Right, right.
Hmm.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
So one of the things that you seem to do is you seem to manage a pretty interesting balance between artistic work and what we might call commercial work or work for hire. I mean, if I really wanted to honor what like podcast listeners wanted to know, it'd be like, where does he get the gigs, man? Right? But how do you approach, putting yourself out there to get commercial work? How do you select from the projects that come available, and then what do you use as sort of your measure for when you have to balance out personal work with commercial work?
Okay. So it's funny. I think there's a lot of things that I haven't published on my website yet, and I'm super excited to like actually get them out into the world, because then people will be able to see sort of more of my personal work. The last 2 years have been really about client work and working on projects for other people. So I'm super excited to sort of get more work out on my website. If to answer your first question about where do I get my gigs, I think the gigs naturally. I mean, I feel very fortunate to say this, but they come. They just naturally happen now. I guess my work has become widespread enough where people just sort of know, which is nice. But before all that, where I got my start was I just, I started this website where I would just post about like the work that I was doing. Like it was really, really basic processing stuff. And if you go back on my website, a couple pages, like maybe 4 pages or so, you'll see like the most basic processing sketches.
Okay.
And I think what's really important is to get your work out there and write about it in a way that kind of expresses what you were trying to do with it. And if other people see it and they're like, oh yeah, this person gets it, their type of thinking is right along the lines of like what we're trying to do in this project. I think that's really important. Like, it's not just about pretty pictures, but it's about the thinking behind the work. It's about how the work was made and how the work was presented as well and framed. I think with every blog post, I try to write it in such a way that it's not just about the pretty pictures, but it's also about the systems, and it's also about like exploring these systems, and it's also about the lessons learned and all that stuff. So I would recommend like getting your work out there as soon as possible. Like you might not be proud of it like 4 years later, but it might get you some work. So that's how I got my start. And then
Okay.
what was the other question?
what do you use as your measure for balancing
Hmm.
between client work and your personal work? I mean, is it the kind of thing where you start like really feeling the itch to do work, and so you like set client stuff aside to work? You know, do you do either or are you constantly cooking up both sides? Or do you build your personal work off of things that you've learned with client projects? How do you play off the two sides, the
Gotcha.
client work or the commercial work and the artwork?
Yeah, I think to be honest, it's a very organic process where I haven't set clear boundaries. Um, Here is the general sort of my general like strategy or perspective on it. If someone comes to me and proposes a project that I find interesting or challenging or like uh, just fascinating technically, like maybe it's a super complex problem, or maybe the data set's really interesting, or maybe the aesthetics that are going to be explored are cool, or maybe this is a completely free project that's going to benefit schools and kids and blow their minds and expose them to this stuff at a really early age. So it all depends on kind of like the underlying idea. And then, if it's for a company, then it becomes a client project. So that's just naturally how it goes. My personal work is, I mean, if I had the choice, I would just do personal work all day, every day for the rest of my life. Because I think I have a whole list of like things I've been writing down for about 3 years now that I haven't really had a chance to get into until actually recently I left my job, my full time job.
Uh-huh.
I think the balance, to be honest, like completely frank, is like whenever I feel like the bank account's getting too low, I will do a client job. Um, or whenever I feel like the client is like sort of shares a similar sort of like perspective and the way of working is similar and they're sort of like innovative and like sort of leading the field.
Right.
That's totally like another um, sort of criteria. I think because the thing is, you'll get approached all the time about doing projects with people. You really have to be selective, otherwise, you're going to end up doing a bunch of projects that you'll never want to blog about or publish because you're not proud of them at the end of the day.
Right.
You know.
Right.
So the process is really just it's me evaluating like, do I find value in this, and will this be good for other people?
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. Now, when I look at your work, one of the things I notice is that you're primarily doing work on sort of like standard computer systems, but
Hmm.
seemingly kind of recently, you did some work with Santa Barbara Museum of Art, I think,
Right.
and on an iPad application that
Hmm.
sort of explores cubism. Can you tell us a little bit about that? And then to extend the conversation, then I'm going to want to know how you like working on these smaller devices, and what do you think are the positives and negatives of doing that, of putting
Right.
your work on that.
So this was a client project done in 2011, so it's recent-ish, um, and the whole project was centered around analytic cubism and having people learn about that in a way that's way more engaging than just sort of looking at a painting. I mean, that's also fascinating. You can learn a ton by just sitting there and looking. But I do think when people play and put the pieces together for themselves, they're really engaging in the work and things are happening in their minds that is just beyond just, you know, uh, sort of casually observing. So the project was a collaboration between me and two museums, the Santa Barbara Museum of Art and the Kimball Art Museum. Ike Khan, who's the main curator there, she is fantastic about um, sort of what her goals are and her intentions are for the work. And she's a great curator and she's fantastic to talk to. So we had a lot of conversations about what they wanted to do, what they wanted to like get across to their patrons and their the people coming through the museums.
Sure.
So this was actually my first iPad application, and so it was a giant learning experience for both parties. For them, this was their first iPad application that augmented an exhibit. So we actually worked closely together for many, many months on this project. This was like a labor of love, I would say, for sure. And we came up with a couple interactive experiences, and then sort of I had this job of going and sort of implementing it and figuring out what works and what doesn't work and getting feedback. So it was very much like, it was an awesome project because the learning was just through the roof. I mean, I was learning how to do really simple things in code and also like really complex things with UIs and interfaces that eventually like taught me, you know, some of the things that I still use today. So specifically, like, what was really fascinating about the project is like there were small data viz parts of the project, there were small games and puzzles, there were just visual elements that were fun to make, there were generative systems that, you know, controlled the force graphs.
Right.
And on top of it all, the biggest challenge was making it usable for people. A lot of the times you'll see a generative application and it just, well, more recently, some of the better ones are great, but the controls are sort of just, you know, just not intuitive. So making this thing usable and making the interface usable was a pretty big challenge. This was the first time that I had to do many, many iterations to get it to feel right. And this was a great learning experience. So I'd recommend, like, for anyone who hasn't done this kind of project, to dive into a project like this where other people will be using it and study how they use their application, because that's it's a great learning experience.
Yeah, that's really cool insight. Now, one of the things that when I looked at it, it kind of freaked me out is that part of the application actually shows some of the artist's work, and then you can kind of like stick your finger in and kind of swirl it around a little, right? You can like change coloring and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
That actually surprised me, given that it was coming from a museum background, because normally they treat that stuff pretty sort of like
You don't want to touch the
the
work.
Pope's robes, right?
Right. Well, what was really interesting about this was Ike is definitely an innovator, and she had, in terms of like changing colors and stuff, she had a company come in and take images of the work at different wavelengths, so like infrared, UV, and visible light. So I think for the museums, it was really about exposing the different layers, you know, not really like applying an Instagram filter on it, but just showing what is there that we can't see.
Oh, that's interesting, because I was wondering, there was a discussion in the description about it being like spectral imaging, and I wasn't actually sure what that meant.
Sure. Yeah, that's basically what it is. Basically, images that are taken at different wavelengths in the visible spectrum, or not visible, but just spectrum in general. And then, yeah, those three sort of infrared, UV, and visible are sort of mashed up together in one screen, and you can sort of change the levels of one to see, you know, the other, and then sort of get a better understanding for what was done in the work. Because at different wavelengths, you can actually see further down in the paint. So you can actually see something that the artist painted over, which is actually really fascinating if you're thinking about process and understanding an artist's process.
That's something that artists who utilize code will never have. There's never sort of like the base layer that we paint over. I mean, it exists, but the delete key takes care of that pretty quickly.
Yeah, right? Totally. Well, that's the thing about the work that we do on computers, is that everything is so easily deleted. You can just
Right.
drag it to the trash can, and it's as if it never existed. And I think that is, personally, I feel right now, I feel like that is the best and worst thing about the field. I mean, I'm obsessed with like having everything be neat and clean and sort of well designed, but I'm also you know when you have a bunch of things around you that remind you of your past, or just fill your space
Right.
with sort of character. You feel certain things, your brain gets activated in certain ways, and it's kind of sad that you can't look at all your computer programs at once or your sketches at once. You can print them out, have them on your wall, or 3D print them and have them on your table, which is actually what I've been starting to do now, because um, the materiality and like having an art object is actually worthwhile in a lot of ways.
One of the things that this discussion kind of like makes you think about is the fact that right now, in a lot of cases, we're sort of living off of the inadvertent artifacts of our favorite artists. If
Yeah.
you were a Jimi Hendrix fan, there still seems to be like a new Jimi Hendrix album every 2 years, right?
Mhm.
Because they find scraps of tape behind the sofa or something, and it has more work.
Mhm.
It seems like the generation of active artists now aren't going to be leaving that trail of crumbs behind them in the way that every previous generation had.
Right. Yeah, it's sort of a bummer. To resurrect those programs, you'll have to, get an emulator,
Right.
which will be really interesting. That's why recently, for the last year, I took a dive into the web, and I spent some time really getting my hands dirty with what is the internet? Like, how do we serve content? Um, how do we get that content to show across all browsers in the same way, right? Like, as an artist, you don't want your work to
To be
be
compromised,
changed.
yeah.
Yeah, be compromised because of like what browser someone's using to experience it. So to me, it was like a dive into sort of this uncomfortable, uncharted territory for me, and I came out of it, and I realized a couple things. Like, the internet is the place where things go, where they can be easily shared, um, and the longevity of, hopefully, like, the browsers will allow that work to live as long as possible, which is really great. Um, but if you're trying to do innovative, cutting edge things in new media, I think there are definitely limitations there
Right.
of what you can do and share and experience. So to me, it's like this sandbox experience where I can share something very quickly, um, but I don't know if what I'm sharing is really, in my mind, innovative.
Right.
I mean, don't get me wrong. I think there's amazing things going on the internet. For example, Jono Brandel's work with Patatap and Isaac Cohen's sort of crazy, awesome wombs experience, and
Right.
they're doing some great stuff.
But it doesn't. You don't feel like your voice necessarily fits that frame yet.
I feel like, um, yeah, you're right. I mean, I don't feel like that is the place where I feel comfortable expressing my ideas yet. I'd love to. I mean, I'd spent almost a year working for this JavaScript startup called Famous, which is their mission was to beautify the interfaces um, on the internet, and they did a great job actually doing that. And while I was there, I realized the internet definitely is going to be the future sort of platform. But I also realized maybe it's not there yet. Maybe for me personally, my artwork still needs to exist as you know non-sandboxed kind of applications.
Right. Well, let's talk a little bit more about the iPad, because that is a very very different experience than working on a laptop or
Right.
a projection based system.
Mhm.
If for no other reason than your user interface and the result has to share the same space.
Right. That is a challenge. It's basically a design challenge. It's a constraint, but I personally think constraints are the best because once you have your constraints in place, you can be as creative as possible. And I truly think that designing a beautiful UI that goes on top of your application is just as important as what your application is doing. People don't want to use something that looks like it was made in, you know, early 2008.
Right.
They're expecting things to be shiny and pretty, and they want their movements to be right. And if they're not right, they will know and they will say something about it. But if they are right, the design challenge has been solved, and it basically allows them to go deeper into the experience without actually compromising anything. So it's a very tricky challenge. The screen space is smaller, but I think when people engage in the content, it's way more visceral and tactile, and what you see and what you touch is what you get, right? The mouse is sort of this indirect way of trying to get the computer to do what you want, but with touches, it's just so much more, on point per se. Right?
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, particularly that it's tactile, because one of the so there's been all of these efforts to put like art and artful programs on all of these different devices, and some of the first beatdowns of stuff driven on tablets was that, oh yeah, it's all good and fine, but if there's a slider and there's not an actual slider there, it's not as satisfying as, it's not as tactile as actually having a slider, which I guess is true.
Right.
But on the other hand, there's no device that I know of right now that has a physical slider on it that can have the user interface or the product of that slider existing right underneath the slider. So I always thought that was kind of a funny critique of the tablet experience, and it seems like as people are getting a little more thoughtful about their user interface design, that some of that is breaking down. It's actually you're becoming more connected to what's on the screen through the touching.
Completely. I mean, I think the whole concept of a slider is a legacy thing.
Right.
I mean, when I see a screen and I want to manipulate some parameter, the whole screen's touch screen shall be the space for manipulation, right? I mean, it's kind of stupid to be able to you want to be able to hit a specific part of your screen to change something.
Right.
I sort of I totally get what you're talking about when people want to touch things and sort of twiddle knobs. And I think that comes from the whole music making process. It's very satisfying,
Right.
But it's also it reminds me of when people listen to vinyl and they have that slight hiss of the vinyl.
Mm-hmm.
It's beautiful and it puts you in a different place. But I don't think they're going to build that slight hiss back into MP3s. It's just not going to happen.
Right.
So I think they're just two different things, and they have different capabilities, right? And
they kind of have two different audiences as well. I mean, to a certain extent, it's already rapidly getting to a point where talking about sliders is sort of like the equivalent of talking about vinyl in tubes, which it rapidly digresses into old guy radio,
Yeah.
And because I hate to say it's strictly generational because I don't think it is, but there does seem to be this sense where people who are not married to a specific past seem to be really open to ownership of new user interfaces.
Right. And I like those people. And I don't know, I think whenever I make anything, I totally understand what parts of the past it's embracing. Like the UI library, I know that there are some aspects of it that are so antiquated. But I know that when you make something, you can't make it so foreign and so weird that no one's going to get it.
Right.
So we're in that transition state where there are going to be some things that are old and there are going to be some things that are new. It's kind of like when Apple's UI, went from completely
Skeuomorphic, right? Yeah.
to completely flat, right?
Right.
So if they did that in the beginning, they would lose a lot of people. But they took the right strategy where they're just over time evolving their UI and making it better and better. And I hope to do that with the UI project as well. Like, there are some really exciting things that I'm going to start prototyping and making over the next sort of year, and hopefully share that with the community as well.
Given what we've just talked about in regards to UI and stuff, what are the things that you see right now that you think are interesting and attractive, sort of best examples of UI design? What are things, just, whether they're physical entities or software pieces or whatever, what are the things that you look at and say that's the right stuff?
Wow. Okay, let's think about this.
Look around your apartment. You probably bought some of it.
Yeah. Okay, well, God, that's such a hard question, though, to be honest, because there are a couple things that I use every day, and I know their UI is like not perfect. It's really okay. So the other day, I saw this prototype for a car user interface, and it was by this designer. Let's see, what was his name? Mathis Kren. I'm not sure if I'm writing, sort of spelling that right, but basically, if you Google a new car UI, you'll see that like the concepts there are fascinating. The UI is beautiful, and honestly, he recognized the problem and started to solve it. Right. I think when I look at projects like that, I see the future happening and coming, and I get really excited about that. Those are the things that I sort of look forward to in terms of UI. I have a couple ideas as well in terms of like sort of gestural-based UIs. Like, I was really excited about Leap Motion as well. I have yet to still sort of go really, really deep into that. Hopefully in the next 6 months, sort of do a project with Leap Motion. Google Glass is another sort of UI that I'm sort of fascinated with. A friend of mine works at Glass, and he's a fantastic designer, and I'm really excited about the kind of things that he's going to produce as well. So, yeah, I think about these new machines and their interfaces, and I get super excited about the future of UI there, because I recognize these products are futuristic, right? So those are the things that I'm fascinated with right now, especially because I used to be a researcher at Nokia working on wearable technology and sort of these interactive ecologies. And we did a lot of UI work with touchscreens and phones and tablets and, wearable technology devices. Like, I can't tell you what they are, but those are the things that also got me excited. And it's kind of sad that I haven't seen more of those things out in the world. I have a Nike Fuel Band. I wear it every day. I love the UI on that. It's super simple. There's one button and there's a bunch of LEDs that are on the screen. It's probably one of my favorite things to just touch and play with. It's tactile and it's got LEDs, so who doesn't love that, right?
Right.
My iPhone is also another object that I think is fascinating. So, I mean, these are the objects that I interact with every day. I think the MakerBot's UI is interesting. I'm just looking at the objects in my room now.
Okay, sure.
And, it does its function. There's some things about it that, like, what's really interesting about the MakerBot is that it is like the printer of the future, right?
Right.
And imagine having to like, you feed your printer paper. That's like a normal thing people do, right?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, the printer's out of paper. I'd like to get to the point where 3D printers are like essentially that, where I just ran out of material. I just have to feed it more material, and there isn't so much like upkeep or sort of function around.
Yeah, the maintenance functions, right?
Exactly. So, um, when those problems exist, there are still design challenges to be solved. So, I think the key thing about making good UI is just recognizing frustration and solving that frustration and allowing you to like go beyond what's possible, you know?
Right. So what do you think right now represents the biggest hurdle to getting to better user, kind of more ubiquitous, better user interface designs?
The hurdles, I think just recognizing frustration is is something that a lot of people aren't able to do because they just accept the fact that you have to do it this way. I think when someone starts to like learn how things are made and program, they understand that it was made that way and someone was thinking about, or someone wasn't thinking about, the frustration that might be caused by the interface provided. I think if people understood that, people use technology all the time, but there's a huge difference between using and making and understanding how things are made. So I think once we get more people who understand how things are made, once we get more people writing code and processing or open frameworks or 3D printing or just making things with Arduino, we're going to start to get people who are going to start to question what are the norms in terms of interfaces and products, and what can we do that's better. I mean, it's already starting to happen. You can look at Kickstarter, and there are so many projects on there that solve everyday frustrations. I think we need more people to be frustrated and understand why they're frustrated. That's the biggest hurdle. And once we get over more people on board in that boat, there's just going to be, the future is going to get way better, because hopefully that will breed more designers and makers and hackers who will just change it, and make it better.
Yeah, that's a great view of it, and actually what that does too is sort of like honors the millions of hours every day that people experience frustration. Yep. Well, Reza, I want to thank you so much for the time. My dog is telling me that I need to stop, so unfortunately I have to stop.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Oh, it was fantastic, and I appreciate you just kind of opening up and telling us how things are, because it's really fascinating, and I know so many people that appreciate your vision of things. It was really great to hear it from you directly. So thanks, and have a great day.
Anytime. You too, Darwin.
All right. Bye.
Bye.
And that's podcast number 29. Thanks a lot for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed that discussion with Reza Ali. Very interesting, I thought, especially talking in terms of how we engage with the various worlds that we all work in. If you want to find out what's happening with the podcast, you can certainly sign up for the RSS feed on the website, artmusictech.libsyn.com. Otherwise, you can follow me on Facebook, where I'm Darwin Gross, that's Grosse, or you can follow me on Twitter, also at Darwin Gross. I want to again reach out and thank everyone who has been helping out with the podcast, especially all the great people that we've been able to interview. I hope you're enjoying it, and I hope you tune in next week. Thanks a lot.